The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $50, and the loudest man on the lot laughed at him in front of the whole crowd. Harlan Mabry did not laugh back. He just lowered his hand, the bid already his, and looked at what he had bought, a heavy old machine standing off by itself at the fence line, a cast-iron floor-standing platen printing press as tall and near as heavy as a man, all flywheel and treadle, and long hand lever and toggle arms and a round ink disc over a flat platen, the whole of it seized solid and skinned over with orange rust, the ink long dried to black tar in its rollers, so far gone that the crowd read it as nothing but a worn-out hunk of iron. A machine the whole county had written off as dead scrap, that 100 bidders had walked past as too heavy to move and too old to ever run again, and that Harlan had just paid $50 to own, seized frame and dead rollers and all. It was a bright, clear Saturday morning, the kind of hard light that comes off a gravel lot at the end of summer at a county estate auction held in the grassy yard beside a weathered gray barn on the edge of a small river town. Harlan was 72 years old, broad through the shoulders and steady on his feet even now, with a deeply lined face gone brown and weathered, short iron-gray hair under a flat wool cap, gray stubble, and pale, steady eyes that did not move fast. His hands were broad and sure and dark in the creases, with old ink that 50 years of washing had never fully lifted, the hands of a man who had spent a lifetime setting type and pulling proofs. Harlan had worked that trade his whole life, a job printer and letterpress man, the one the town sent for when a thing had to be set true and printed clean and made to last, until the shops went to offset and cold type, and the old men who could set a line of lead by hand and feed a platen press were quietly closed out. The man who laughed was Sid Cawley, who ran the biggest scrap-and-salvage yard in 3 counties, a heavy-set man of about 55, in a loud steel-blue work coat he wore to be seen in, his face clean-shaven and ruddy, a thick gold ring on one hand and a stub of a cigar in the other. $50, Sid said loud, so the whole lot could hear it. $50 for a rusted-up old junk-press printer, frame seized, wheel won't turn, rollers gone to tar, rust 1/8 of an inch thick. Nobody's hand-printed a thing on one of these since before the war, and nobody's going to. You can't run it, you can't move it without a wrecker, and it's too far gone to fix. You didn't buy a press, old-timer. You bought a 1/4 ton of scrap iron, and you paid $50 for the privilege of hauling it home when I'd have taken it off them for the weight. He coined the name right there, loud enough to carry, the old man's junk press, and it stuck for the rest of that month. The crowd laughed because Sid laughed, the way a crowd does. Harlan stood through it without a change in his face, his thumbs hooked in his apron strings, and let the laughter pass, the way weather passes a man who has decided to stand in it. Now, if you have ever watched a quiet, capable man get talked over by a loud one, if you have ever known somebody whose skill the world used when it needed something made and forgot the rest of the time, then you already understand what this channel is about, and you might take a second to subscribe, because the people who stay for stories like Harlan's are exactly who Iron Hook Stories was built for. Harlan said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that work does not answer to noise. What Sid Cawley could not have known, grinning behind his cigar, was that Harlan had stood in front of that rusted press with 50 years of the trade awake in him. The crowd saw a seized hunk of scrap. Harlan saw the press, under the rust, the shape of the frame and the curve of the toggle arms, The way the platen closed on the bed, the pattern the iron had been cast to before anybody painted it black. And the casting was wrong for what they were all saying. He knew what a late factory frame looked like, heavy and plain and stamped out by the hundred, and what an early maker's looked like, cast careful and proud and a little graceful, even in iron. This was an early one. Above all, he knew that the proud old foundries almost always cast their own name into the frame and stamped a serial into the bed. Somewhere the rust would later swallow it. The rest of them were pricing the thing by the pound. Harlan knew the difference between scrap iron and a rare old press somebody had let rust, and what he found when he cleaned it down that night would cut a silenced man's name and the paper he ran the truth on, back into the history that had let them both go. Harlan had come up hard. He went to the composing stone young, learning the case and the stick and the long patient feel of setting lead by hand until a line locked up true, and made himself into the kind of hand a paper or a county office called by name when the work had to be right. His wife Ada had died after a long illness, and they had buried no family of their own, and after Ada was gone he lived alone in a small house behind his old print shop with his cases of type and his quiet. The town had a use for his hands and no use at all for his memory. He knew that. He bid on the press anyway. He bid because he knew it. An early maker's press seized under a fool's rust is a question, and a man who had run 1,000 true forms could no more walk past a rare one going for scrap weight than walk past his own past. The crowd had seen a junk press. Harlan had seen the machine as it was, cast to a careful early pattern by somebody who knew exactly what he was building and had cast his name where a proud foundry cast it. If you've made it this far into Harlan's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He let them sell the rest of the estate first, the implements and furniture and boxed lots knocked down to the dealers while Harlan waited at the fence line beside the tall iron press. When the auctioneer finally came to the seized platen press and called for a bid, Sid glanced at it, called out his joke, and not one other hand went up. Harlan raised one finger, and the gavel came down at 50. He paid cash, signed the slip, and arranged to bring his truck and a chainfall and stout planks around it at the end of the day, because a quarter-ton press was an awkward, heavy thing for one man, and the auction rules gave a man until dark to haul off what he had bought. The story got around the town before Harlan's truck was off the county road. By Monday, people who had not spoken 20 words to him in years stopped him outside the feed store to ask, grinning, whether he was going to print himself some money on his junk press to get his $50 back. Ed Marsh, who ran the hardware counter, said it plainer, that there was nothing to an old press but rust and dead weight, and a family glad to see the back of it. Harlan was buying a can of penetrating oil, a wire brush, and a box of clean rag, and did not look up. "We'll see," he said, and that was the whole of his answer. He had spent 50 years learning that a press is either an early maker's or it isn't, and the noise a crowd makes has nothing to do with which one. But Harlan did not clean the press down in the daylight, with the dealers' trucks still on the lot and Sid holding court by the auction table. He waited until the place had emptied out and he had the heavy machine home, eased down off the truck with the chain fall, and stood square on his shop floor under a single work lamp, and went at it alone that night after the town had gone quiet and the windows up the street had gone dark. The frame was seized hard, and rather than take a grinder to it and scar the iron, he worked it slow, flooded the joints with penetrating oil, let it creep and bite, and eased the rust and dead black paint away with a wire brush and fine steel wool, careful as freeing a stuck lock, reading the casting as it came clean. And when the first clean face of the frame came up under his lamp, he stopped with the rag in his hand, because what came up was not a stamped-out factory casting, but iron shaped by somebody who cared how it looked as well as how it worked, and it stood there like something that had been waiting for exactly this. Down at the diner, they were still asking if he had printed his $50 back yet. Harlan wiped his hands and moved the lamp lower down toward the side of the frame, the way you turn a machine to find the boss where a maker casts his name. The press had its own long, hard history, and the town had let it go for scrap with never once asking after it. It ran all the way back to the maker who had cast it, a renowned 19th century American press maker whose small early machines, built by hand in the first years of his foundry before his name was famous, were the rarest and finest things he ever made, sought a lifetime by museums and almost never found whole. And it ran back, too, to the man who had once run it, a small-town frontier printer generations before, who had freighted that heavy press west into a raw territory town, set it up in a one-room shop, and made himself a newspaper out of it, a one-man weekly he set and printed and folded by hand. He ran the plain work that kept the lamp lit, but he used the press, too, for the thing a free press is for. He printed what the powerful men in that territory did not want printed: the crooked land deal, the rigged company store, the strong leaning on the weak, and ran the truth on it week after week until the men he crossed leaned on him instead, pressured his advertisers and his paper suppliers, shut him down, and drove him under. He lost the paper and the shop and died a poor and beaten man, his crusading little sheet forgotten, and his silenced press sold off and hauled shed to shed until the rust took it and no one alive remembered a brave paper had ever been printed on it. What none of them ever asked was what becomes of a man who prints the truth in a place that would rather it stayed unprinted. The answer had been standing at the fence line the whole time, seized under the rust in a $50 press nobody wanted. Harlan worked the oil and the brush down the side of the frame and eased the last dead paint and scale off the flat of it, and what came up under the lamp told him whose press it was before he had fully cleared it. Cast into the side of the frame, filled and hidden by a lifetime of rust and overpaint, was lettering, not stamped, not stenciled, but cast, raised proud in the iron itself, the way a foundry casts a thing it means to stand behind, a maker's nameplate, and beneath it, when he brushed the bed clean, a serial number struck deep in the metal. Harlan cleaned it out, figure by figure, with a pick and a soft brush, breathing shallow, and when the whole of it stood clear in the lamplight, he set the rag down and stood very still. He knew the name. Any man who had come up in the trade knew that name, a pressmaker spoken of among printers the way woodworkers speak of a master, a foundry whose earliest small presses were half legend, so scarce a whole working life could pass without a man ever laying hands on one. And here it stood, cast in the maker's own iron, with a serial low enough to fix it among the very first he ever built. But the nameplate was only the half of it. Harlan went back over the press inch by inch now, cleaning where the rust had hidden the maker's hand, and low on the bed rail, under the thickest scale where no scrap man would ever have looked, he found more. The faint, painted and stenciled remains of a shop name in a territory town, the mark of the newspaper that had once been printed on it, worn nearly to nothing but there. He copied it down exactly the way you copy a thing you mean to run to ground. And under the last of the rust, the whole machine came clear at last. Not a scrapped-out junk press at all, but a rare early masterwork of American iron. The frame and the toggle and the platen, cast and fitted by a maker at the top of his craft, built to print true for a century and able to do it yet. Harlan stood back from it with the oil-black rag in his hands and understood that the old man's junk press had been a museum-grade early press by a great maker. The entire month the town laughed at it, that the object itself, the machine standing whole in his shop, was the treasure, worth a small fortune to a museum of printing that knew that name, and worth more than money as a working monument to a maker and a silenced paper both. The next morning Harlan did not call a scrap yard, and did not cut the press up for its iron weight, and did not gut it into one of those rustic industrial lamps or a garden ornament for his own porch, and a few in town thought him a fool a second time. He let them. He had spent one whole month being the man who paid $50 for a junk press, and he did not mind being thought a fool by people who had never once been right about the thing in front of them. He carried the maker's cast name and serial first to a museum of printing that knew what the mark meant, then ran the stenciled shop name in the territory town to ground in the old newspaper records and the territorial archives, and set himself to the harder things, to cut a silenced frontier printer's name, and the paper he ran the truth on back into the history that had dropped them, and to find what descendants that printer had left, and put into their hands the fact that their people had run a brave newspaper, not a failed one. The museum's curator went very still over the nameplate and the low serial, and said quietly that an early press by that maker, that serial, whole and cleaned and able to print, was the kind of thing a museum of printing waits a lifetime for and almost never finds, and that the man who first ran it had been no failed small-town printer at all, but exactly the kind of man a free press was invented to protect, and the frontier printer had descendants in the country still, a great-grandson 2 counties over among them, a gray man who had grown up on a scrap of family talk that some old great-grandfather had run a newspaper out west and lost it, a story the family told as a failure and mostly let go. Harlan went to him that fall with a photograph of the cleaned press, the maker's cast name plain on the frame, and the worn shop stencil traced to the man's own silenced paper, and watched a gray man read his own great-grandfather's newspaper, named on the bed of a museum-grade press, beside the curator's word that the man had printed the truth and been driven under for it. He put a hand flat on the table and went quiet. They had grown up thinking their old printer a man who failed at business out west. The cleaned press told them instead that he had run a free paper brave enough to be worth silencing, and that the world had simply chosen to remember the silence instead of the paper. The man asked why he had troubled to come so far to give a beaten ancestor back his good name. Harlan said only that a maker casts his name into his iron, and a printer prints the truth on it, so that being forgotten can never be the same as never having stood, and that he had nobody of his own to leave a thing to. So he had brought the old maker's name and the old paper's name home to the people they were always meant for. There was one thing more Harlan did before the press left his shop, and he did it for the maker and the forgotten printer and for no one else. He freed and conserved the press the slow, careful way over a month of nights, worked the seized frame loose, turn by turn, until the flywheel rolled and the platen closed true again, drew the last rust off gently, and oiled the bright iron, and set new rollers and inked it up, not to make a show of it, but because a machine a great maker had built to print and a brave paper had once been printed on, deserved to do the one thing it was made to do. And he did not cut it up for the scrap drop, and did not gut it into a lamp or a lawn piece, because using a rare early press as scrap weight or a porch ornament was the most ordinary thing in the world, the very thing that had nearly killed it, and there was no truth in it. The truth was the iron itself, the name cast in its frame, and the silenced paper on its bed. So, on the last night, with the museum's people coming in the morning, Harlan set a line of type by hand from his old cases, inked the disk, and pulled one clean sheet on the freed press under the work lamp. A single proof, sharp and black and true, the first honest thing that press had printed in a lifetime. He had not scrapped it or made a lamp of it. That part was never the point. He had freed it so that the man who built it and the man who ran the truth on it would be known one time by somebody who finally understood what they were. That fall the press went where it belonged, into a museum of printing, with the maker's name read clear at last, and the silenced frontier paper named beside it in the record, and the pride of it, and a share of what a rare early press like it is worth, went to the printer's descendants the stencil helped Harlan find generations late, so the family that had thought their old man a failure knew at last that he had run a brave paper worth silencing. Word of it went around the town the same as the laughter had, only quieter, and the people who had called Harlan a fool let the name the old man's junk press drop and did not pick it up again. Sid Cawley was not run out of business and was not made a villain. He was simply a man who had laughed loud at a thing he never bothered to look at, and the next time he held court by the auction table, the others did not lean in so far. Harlan never said a word against him. Being right was the whole of what he had wanted, and it had brought a great forgotten maker's name and a silenced frontier paper back up out of a lifetime of dead rust. The museum kept the press where the town could see it. They set the tall iron press on a low platform behind a rail in the front hall under a soft light, the frame clean and oiled and dark again, the flywheel freed and the platen closing true, the maker's cast nameplate read clear, and the low serial struck plain on the bed, the rare early work of a renowned pressmaker restored to his own name at last, and beside it a framed proof pulled fresh on the machine, and a card that told whoever came through that this press had been built by one of the great makers and then had run a brave frontier newspaper printed by a man the powerful drove under, both thrown away and left to rust when hand printing died, and remembered again only because somebody troubled to clean the thing they laughed at. And on a still evening that next spring, the light going gold through the tall front windows, Harlan Mabry drove over to look in on it. And there in the last of the sun stood the iron press, whole and freed and seen at last. The dark, oiled iron glowing where a stranger's hands had finally reached it. Harlan was 72 years old, a man the auction had laughed at one whole month, and he stood quiet a long moment and laid one broad, ink-marked hand flat on the cool iron frame beside the cast name and nodded once, the way a man nods at a job that was done right. The work had said it for him, the way work always did. A maker casts his name into his own iron, and a printer prints the truth on it. And each trusts that somebody will come who can read what their hands made under whatever the years lay over it, so that being forgotten for a lifetime can never be the same as never having stood, and a town rarely knows what genius or what courage was left to rust at its own fence line until somebody troubles to clean the thing they laughed at. So, I'll leave it to you. Was Harlan Mabry right to give the press to a museum under the maker's name and put the worth of it into the family's hands without keeping it for himself? Or was that one decency too far in a world that had laughed at him for nothing? Tell me which one in the comments, and I'll read them.